Hey Steven, you're recording with both the Canon and the Sony?
Yeah.
Yeah, yell pineapple if the Canon overheats.
Pineapple.
Jared Polin, FroKnowsPhoto.com, and this is a preview of the long-awaited and many times to be rumored but never released A7S III. Now, before we go too far into this video, I do want to let you know that the A7S III that we have has pre-production firmware. So it's not final firmware. We think that the body in terms of the construction is production, but this is pre-production firmware. That's why it's called a preview, not a full review. But this we are putting against the Canon EOS R5 because a lot of people want to know how the EOS R5 compares to this dedicated Sony, basically, video camera. Now, how we are recording this is I'm recording right now with the Sony a7S III in the middle. To the left of that, we have the Canon EOS R5. All the way on the other side is the Nikon Z6, which is the camera that I always use when I'm at my desk. It has a locked off manual focus lens that's always locked on to me. It's not going to shift, but with the other two cameras, we are relying solely on the IAF and lock-on tracking, not that I'm going too far. On top of that, we have the same settings across the board, and we are filming in the highest quality that these cameras offer us in 4K. So that means the EOS R5 is taking the 8K and downsampling it to 4K. We've got the one in the middle, which is doing the 4K highest for the Sony, and then the Nikon does whatever Nikon is going to do. Now, we're not shooting in S-Log, we're shooting in the standard picture styles, and then we go ahead and we can tweak that after the fact if we need to do so. The reason we're not using the S-Log is it just takes a hell of a lot more color correction in the Sony to get it closer to show the proper colors than it does from the Canon, or just doing it this way, it's much easier and faster. Now, we know that the Canons have some overheating issues, and if we have an overheating issue, Steven will yell pineapple, which is our secret word right now, if it overheats and shuts off, and then you'll know that it didn't go as far as the other two. Also, we're testing out the preamps of both the Canon and the a7S III. That's why I'm wearing two microphones that you can't see right now underneath my shirt, but this is the preamp right now on the Canon side, and now we're going to switch to the preamp on the Sony side. With that being said, we're most likely sticking with the Sony on this because it is a review of the Sony, but when Steven does switch cameras, he will note that so you can see which camera is being used. Okay, so now let's dive into the preview of the a7S III. The S stands for higher sensitivity, faster speed, Supreme. They basically say that S stands for Supreme. They reinvented this camera from the ground up. It's kind of like me. I'm highly sensitive, I'm super fast, and I'm very supreme. Well, Steven would yell at me if I said that I'm supreme at taking pictures and all, so I match 2 out of 3 of these. Let's get into the feel of the body. It's gonna feel basically the same as the A7 R4 feels, very similar to the A9 II. This is probably what the A7 IV will feel like. One of the only differences you will find is that the A7S III now has a record button on the top of the camera instead of having to use the record button on the back of the camera. That is actually an added bonus because it's nice and big. You can't really miss it. Now, there is an entirely new 12.1 megapixel BSI reverse structure full frame sensor. Now, reverse structure, from what we can tell, is the same thing as a BSI sensor. They just want to call it something else to confuse everybody and to confuse me, because it's a BSI full frame sensor that's still at 12.1 megapixels. Now, the reason they went with 12.1 megapixels is because they can get larger pixels at 8.5 micrometers, which makes it more sensitive to light and better in low light situations with less noise. Now, some of the rumors were talking about this being a stacked sensor. It does not have a stacked sensor like the A9. It also does not have a global shutter, so you may get a little bit of weeble wobble when it comes to rolling shutter. There is now a Bionz XR engine, which is said to be 8 times faster than the Bionz X. Now, I'm not sure why they just didn't call it the XR8 or 8XR because it's 8 times faster, but hey, I don't work for Sony. Anyway, it has a faster readout than the a7S II. It is said to be 2 times faster with the readout off the sensor. And because it has a faster readout, that should help minimize and cut down on any type of rolling shutter. The ISO has been lowered to 80 from 100, so your native ISO goes from 80 to 102,400. Sony is claiming that you have 15 stops of dynamic range, or 15 plus stops of dynamic range in S-Log3. Now, I don't know how you gauge this, because if you were to just release a video from S-Log3, it would look like a 18% grayed out mess with not a lot of information and color there. Now, when you go ahead and correct it, especially when I'm correcting images and I go ahead and up my contrast, I'm cutting down on the dynamic range anyway. So this is subjective in my opinion. So with that being said, the Canon over here is said to have 12 stops of dynamic range. Now, when we go ahead and correct the S-Log3 versus the C-Log, we kind of feel like they're very similar at the end of the day, because once you add the correction, they almost look pretty identical. One of the biggest complaints you hear about Sony cameras over the years is, oh, the menu system. The menu system is so bad. It's so horrible. I can't learn it because I'm coming from another system. Well, that's your fault. The more you use something, the more you learn it. Is it confusing at times? Sure. Now you don't have to worry about it because they went to a new menu system that kind of looks like it's straight out of Fisher-Price's camera because everything's muted and blocky and looks cartoonish. It's better because you can go deeper into the menus, meaning you can see a preview of what's in the sub-menu. When you're clicking on one thing, you can go to the next menu, and you can also touch everything. It is so nice to be able to touch the menu system and actually get to have a reaction, because you couldn't do that before. We could do it with every other camera on the market for the most part, but now you can touch the new menu system. You can go deeper into the menus. It scrolls very similarly to how deep that the Nikon goes. So they've just updated. I'm sure people will complain about something about it, but look, you use a menu system, you learn a menu system, and you forget about it because it's about taking pictures and taking video. And to add on to that, you can now touch the function menu with the Sony. Now that's similar to what you can do with the Nikon, where you hit the I menu and you can touch that on the back of the screen, and what Canon can do. Now, what's also good is that Sony split the menus between photo and video. That hasn't been done before, and now they've done it, at least in the Sony. Moving on to the next page, we've got a 3-inch 1.44 million dot vari-angle screen. That's right, it's vari-angle. It can flip out, rotate. I could look at it, Steven could look at it, you could look at it. Will you just look at it? No, really, look at it. Is it 3 inches? I know 3 inches. I'm used to 3 inches. This does not look like 3 inches to me. It really looks like a smaller LCD screen on the back of the camera. Maybe the entire housing is 3 inches, but it just doesn't compare and match up to the other cameras. It just feels a little smaller. Now, one of the comparisons between the R5 and the S3 right here is that on the screen, the R5 actually has a record button that you could physically touch if you're like looking at it and you want to touch it and you don't want to reach to the top of the camera. The Sony doesn't offer that. Is that a big deal? No. I just thought I would mention it to you because we said it's a comparison, and we do have more comparisons coming up between these two cameras. Let me jump in here real quick to show you 2 images taken with Sony cameras and edited with FroPack 1 and FroPack 2, starting with this eagle. So for nature and wildlife images, I like to start with Skittles because it gives me a really good starting point. Let's show you that again. We come over here to Skittles and we go boom, and it gives me an awesome starting point. This next image, I like to come down to FroPack 2. Let's check out Apollo No White Balance. Really cool starting point, as well as Burnt Sienna. With one click, this is what I was getting. Now, if you're looking to speed up your RAW workflow or give yourself a good starting point, we created 29 different unique custom Lightroom presets that you can check out right now at FroKnowsPhoto.com/presets. While you're over there, you can play with the sliders to see the befores and the afters. And if you decide to pick up FroPack 1 and FroPack 2 right now, you can save when you pick it up as the bundle. Moving on to stabilization, we have 5-axis IBIS, which is the same as you find in the R4 and the A9 II, but they also added active stabilization, which is optical, but it does add a slight crop when you turn that feature on. However, you still do get a 1-to-1 pixel readout. So here's a quick clip that we did outside between the R5 and the S3, and you can decide which one you think is better. Sony made a big deal out of this camera having the world's first QXGA OLED EVF at 9.44 million dots with a 60 or 120 frames per second refresh rate. They said it's like looking through a window, and I say, nyat. I mean, yeah, it's a nice electronic viewfinder, but I think that the R5's viewfinder is very good. I think that the Z6 and Z7's viewfinders are very good. My issue with this Sony viewfinder is the fact that the font that they use for the information display on the bottom, like the 1/250th of a second, just doesn't seem sharp and crisp. It seems like it's jaggedy, like it has a jagged edge, as Alanis Morissette would say it has a jagged little pill, but it just doesn't seem clean. I mean, the Nikon and the Canon both have very clean looking numbers when you're looking through the viewfinder. So because of that in the Sony, that it just looks jaggedy, maybe they haven't updated it in like 7 years, who knows? But if they did that and they made it look nice and clean and nice and smooth, maybe I would have noticed the 9.44 million dots. Now, don't get me wrong, the image is very nice that you see in there, but I don't know that there's much of a difference that I can personally notice between the Nikon and the Canon. This is the world's first camera to have 4 card slots. There's 4 card slots in this camera. And actually, there's 2 card slots. Let me explain. It can take dual SD UHS-2 cards. Now, those slots are also reverse compatible with CF Express Type A cards. That's right, Type A. It uses the same exact slot. So if you have SD, use SD. If you have the new CF Express Type A cards, you can put those in there. Now, if you're not familiar with CF Express A, B, and C, A is this new format that is slightly smaller than SD cards, but it is much faster and it feels more durable than SD cards. Now, B is what you find in the Nikon Z6, Z7. You find it in the EOS R5, and you find it in a bunch of other cameras at this point. That's a slightly larger card, but it is a much faster card. Now, this explains a lot about where Sony is going in the future with their A9 II. Are they going to just include CF Express Type A and skip B altogether so they can keep the smaller and lighter camera? For photos, I'm cool with that because they're super fast cards any way you slice it. They're much faster than the SD cards, so I would like to see Sony continue to do that. I would prefer the Type B cards because I never outran shooting RAW at 20 frames per second in the 1DX Mark III, which takes those XQD Type B cards. Now, since I mentioned C is something that we haven't seen yet, but those are going to be larger cards that are going to have higher capacity and be much faster and definitely more expensive. You'll probably find those going into higher end cinema cameras. Since I'm talking about the dual memory card slots, the Sony lets you record redundant video no matter what mode you're in, where opposed to the Nikon, hey Nikon, you got 1 card slot, you suck. You just stay there and you be quiet, okay? The Canon over here, though, can do redundant recording, but it's not like redundant. You're actually, you can record 2 videos at the same time, but one's a proxy off of the other one. Since this is the first camera that I know of that is using CF Express Type A cards, and I don't think there's any cards out from ProGrade just yet, Sony is releasing a tough CF Express Type A card, which will come in at 160 gigs as well as 80 gigs and will be priced at $370 and $190, and their read-write speeds are 700 megabytes per second, which is half the rate of CF Express Type B. But in our testing of this camera, we didn't run into any issues with speed whatsoever in any of the modes we were shooting in with the A7S III. Steven, how's the overheating of the Canon?
Still good.
Don't say that word unless it overheats. Don't say, he's not going to say it. All right, moving on. We've got photo features of the A7S III. Here they are. 10 frames per second mechanical, 10 frames per second silent. You can do 1,000 uncompressed RAW files, of course, because of the CF Express Type A. And really, that's like, this isn't a camera meant for shooting photos. It can shoot photos at 12.1 megapixels, and it may be good in low light situations, but that was cool in 2007. you know, with my D3 when I could get 12 megapixels in a full frame camera. You're not buying this camera to shoot stills. No matter what Sony tries and tells you and tries to tell you that the autofocus is so much better and blah, 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 and low light this and low light that. If you need a hybrid camera, you're not looking at this Sony a7S III. You're looking at like an a7 III, an a7 R4. Sony has you covered if you want a hybrid camera because they all do really good jobs with stills as well as video. In this case, comparing it to the EOS R5, the R5 walks all over this camera when it comes to stills. Continuing on, we've got advanced AF performance that is 30% better with the new processor for stills and video. Now, that is all well and good. Sony spent a lot of time saying why this was important and good when it came to still photos, and of course it's great for video. They said that it's better than the a7 R4, but the reason for that it has better capability of tracking and focusing is they're smaller pixels, so it probably doesn't have to go through as much data. And with all that being said, I've used the a7 R4 since it came out, and I love its autofocus. So any advantage that they say is there is probably indecipherable between the two, but maybe we'll see an advancement in the future of the a7 IV and whatever comes after the a7 R4 and whatever comes after the a9 II. Since we're talking about focus tracking and speed, we tested the S3 against the R5 inside just to see how the IAF and tracking would do, and they are very, very similar. Canon has done a fantastic job catching up to Sony because Sony's been the best of the best with Honor Sir for a long time. And what's interesting is that the Canon's IAF found me further away than the Sony's. So I could walk further away with the Canon and it still found my eye, where the Sony switched over to the face. Do I think that's a big deal? No, it's probably just an overlay thing that Canon's like, yeah, we're gonna be cool. We're gonna show you an overlay over the eye. But they both really did a fantastic job of locking on and tracking the eye no matter what I was doing. Let me cut in here and remind you that I offer 4 different educational video guides that are digital downloads. We've got the FroKnowsPhoto guide to getting out of auto, the flash guide, the guide to shooting video, as well as the guide to editing video. To check out free previews of each of these guides, head on over to FroKnowsPhoto.com/guides. The a7S III has 759 phase detect autofocusing points that now cover 92% of the frame. It's the first camera from Sony that offers the 92% coverage.
Pineapple.
Geez, you scared me, Steven. Is it overheating?
27 minutes.
We're 27 minutes in. Doesn't it stop at 30 anyway? Oh, it does stop at 30 anyway. So yeah, we're 27 minutes in. All the other cameras are doing fine, but the Canon just got yelled at by Pineapple. Now, I know I said 27 minutes. That's because we're recording this and every once in a while I stop to check my notes to make sure we're good. So that's why we're 27 minutes record time in and you're not 27 minutes into this video. Sony did a good job of putting the mic and headphone jack in a better place, because when you are trying to rotate the screen, the headphone jack and the microphone cords do not get in the way like they do with, say, the Canon over here. Hey, Steven, how's the Canon doing, by the way?
Still overheated.
Yeah, it overheated, so when we reset it after it's done and it overheated, we're not gonna wait 20 minutes, 30 minutes. We're not gonna put it in the fridge while the Sony continues to run without any overheating issues. The Sony's hot shoe is still a digital multi-interface. It's the same one that you find in the a7 R4, but it does now offer 48 kilohertz, 24-bit, 4-channel audio. I don't know what that means. Steven told me to say it. Now this is what everybody's been waiting for. What resolutions do you have inside of this camera? You've got 10-bit 422 4K UHD with a full pixel readout without pixel binning in all modes, along with S-Log2 and S-Log3. Now those are impressive features, but maybe it would have been more impressive 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago. I mean, the a7S II came out like 5-ish years ago, and people have been waiting a long time. So even if it was 2 years ago, this camera would have blown up the market because everybody wanted these features, and now that they're out, they're really good features, but there's other cameras that can offer you things that are pretty similar. Will they overheat? Yeah, probably, but that's beside the point. We did a side-by-side comparison of the highest res 4K modes shooting geese. Were they Canadian geese, Steven?
Yeah.
Yeah, because they're Canadian geese down here. You guys call them American geese in Canada. We call them Canadian geese down here because they're a pain in the butt. We did C-Log in the Canon with the downsampled 8K to 4K, which is the highest quality for 4K. And we did S-Log 3 in the highest 4K offered by the A7S III. Now, I will tell you that we do feel that the Canon straight out of the camera, looks sharper. It just looked much sharper right out of the camera than the A7S III. Now that's probably because it's 8K downsampled to 4K. Now you can add sharpening to the S-Log 3 after the fact to get it closer, but right out of the camera, the Canon looked better. But keep in mind, these are log formats, so no sharpening was added in the camera at all, and still the Canon looked better right out of the camera. You do have 4K at 120 frames per second, and the highest one you have to be in S&Q mode. Now that gives you no audio, but it's 120 all-eye compression at up to 1.2 gigabits a second. But all the 120 modes, we noticed a subtle crop. It's not a major crop, but there is a little bit of a crop when you go into 4K 120 video. However, you're still getting full pixel readout in the Sony, where you're getting line skipping in the R5 when it shoots 120 video. And based on our tests, the Sony is giving us better 4K 120 video. If you're wondering why aren't we showing the Canon Angle anymore, because it hasn't cooled down enough to let us shoot again. And mind you, it's about 78 degrees in here when we have the air conditioning off, so it ran for its 27 minutes, 30 minutes, and that was it. And then it turns off, and we're just waiting for it to tell us we can shoot again with it. And we're about 40 minutes in. You're not 40 minutes into this video, but we're 40 minutes into recording it. Speaking of recording, 1080p up to 240 frames per second in all-eye, 10-bit 422. With that being said, there is some pixel binning when you shoot the 240 frames per second. Does it shoot RAW internally like the Canon? Maybe yes, maybe no. It will do 16-bit DCI 4K RAW up to 60 frames per second, clean out to a full, yes, a full HDMI port, unlike the Canon, which has a dinky little dinky port for HDMI. Check this out. You can shoot 4K externally and still record internal 4K at the same time. So basically that's giving you 3 different recordings, 2 inside and 1 outside. So how do you record the 4K 60 RAW? Well, you'll be able to use an Atomos Ninja 5 to record RAW 2 out of this camera, and we think it's probably going to be ProRes format. With the A7S III, you will get unlimited record time. Right now, we're actually about 43 minutes into recording this. You're still not at 43 minutes in this video, but it does do unlimited record time. But if you're gonna do 4K at 60, you will get 60 minutes of record time with 4K 60. Let me jump in here to remind you that the Super Huger Mega Camera giveaway is going on right now, where I'm giving someone the chance to win a camera and lenses valued up to $4,999. Now, it's completely free to get entered. Head on over to bit.ly/megafro2020. Also, if you decide to pick up FroPack 1, FroPack 2, the bundle, or any of my other video guides, you can score extra entries. But remember, there is no purchase necessary to be the grand prize winner. Is there a fan inside of this camera? Well, there's probably some fanboys and fangirls who would love to be inside this camera one way or another, but there is no fan in this camera. Sony told us that they built this in such a way that it has a heat dissipating structure. It doesn't need a fan because somehow they're moving heat off of the sensor around so that it doesn't overheat. Now, I'll tell you that it feels the same heat as the EOS R5. Maybe they just told it to not overheat as soon, but Steven let this thing out in broad daylight for a super long time. And by broad daylight, I mean 93, 94 degrees with like 110 index outside about 4:30, 5 o'clock, and it never overheated. It ran for 80 minutes, and then he's like, you know, we're just gonna stop it because it's never gonna overheat. Whereas the R5 decided to overheat just like it did here, and stop right around that 30 minutes. Now, we also had both screens flipped open because you figure if the screen isn't right against the back of it, maybe it will dissipate some of the heat a little better. And it kind of did, because the next day, we did this the next day, Stephen went ahead and tested it indoors where it was roughly 76 degrees inside, and he got 27 minutes on the R5 and 35 plus before he turned it off with the A7S III, and that's with the LCD screen closed at that time, so flipped in and closed. So he actually got less time indoors with the R5 than he did outdoors with the screen open. It's kind of weird that just opening the screen, even the difference between 20 degrees inside and outside, made a difference. We'd have to test it multiple times to see if it really was that, but maybe a tip is open the screen up on both of these and it will dissipate heat a little better. But we can tell you there is no overheating issue with the A7S III that we've encountered at all in broad daylight, and broad daylight again means super hot, 94, 95 degrees, letting it run and run and run. You'll probably run out of record space on your cards before it overheats, if it ever actually does overheat. And to add on to that, we were testing it with the highest quality 4K as well. Speaking of formats, there's a new XAVC SI format in this camera that lets you record all I up to 600 megabits per second in the highest quality option. Well, that's 60p. We're recording right now in 24p 4K, which is giving us the 240 megabits per second. There's also another new format, which is XAVC HS format, which is HEVC, which is H.265. Now there's some new autofocus tweaks that you can do. They've updated the AF transition speeds. Now they didn't put product showcase into this camera exactly, but you could still get something pretty similar by tweaking the autofocus speed settings. If you're hoping that this camera has Super 35 to allow you to punch in and still get 4K and get a little bit more reach, it does not offer you that APS-C crop in 4K. It's only in 1080 when you're shooting full HD modes, which makes sense because this is a 4K sensor. Now the A7 III, which has been out for a while, that can go ahead and do the Super 35 because it's downsampling from 6K to 4K, where this one is 4K. It's not downsampling from anything. We're almost there, guys. Is the Canon there yet, Stephen?
Nope.
No, Canon's still out sitting on the bench somewhere. We should go put it in the rain to cool it off because it's pouring out. Now there's a new infrared sensor which helps with auto white balance under artificial light. This will come in handy if it is much better than the regular sensors that they've been using in the past. Something else you'll find is USB-C charging now uses USB 3.2 speed, which is super fast when it comes to transferring the memory card. Why? Because we're using these CF Express Type A cards that there isn't currently a card reader for because Sony didn't send it to us, but we can plug it in via USB-C right into the computer and you can get super fast transfer rates while charging the camera. Now this may be a major or a minor thing depending on who you are, but the Canon EOS R and the EOS R5 and the R6 have a mode where it lets you put the shutter down when you are changing lenses. Now you could also turn that off if you want to have the sensor exposed. The Sony in this case doesn't give you that option, so the sensor is always exposed when you are changing lenses. Let me jump in here and ask you, would you like to build your very own online portfolio? Well, use what I use for jaredpolin.com because I use Squarespace. To get a 14-day free trial, head on over to squarespace.com/FroKnowsPhoto, and if you decide that it's for you, use the code FroKnowsPhoto at checkout to get 10% off your first order. Now, let's get back to the video. Now on to the very important question of price. How much is it? It's $3,500. When the A7S II came out in 2015, around there, it was $3,000. So is this camera worth it for $3,500? Can you work it? Missy, I don't know the lyrics. I can't work it like that. But the Canon R5 is a $38.99 camera. If you're looking for a dedicated camera for video, and you're a Sony shooter, you can't go wrong for the price of $3,500 for the features that it gives you. But again, at $3,500, are you somebody who shoots stills and video, because the a7 III is still a kick-ass body that gives you really good quality video as well as fantastic stills no matter what you're doing. It is a well-rounded camera that is less expensive. Now, in comparison to the Canon, obviously if you're doing long-term shooting, a lot of long stuff in 4K, the Canon's gonna shit the bed and go to sleep fairly quickly in most environments, as we can tell, even indoors. But as a hybrid shooter, as a hybrid camera, for somebody like me, if I had to choose between the two, I'm going with the Canon just because I care more about the stills, and I'm not going to use this for a stills camera. But this camera isn't designed for me. It's designed for you guys out there who want the cinematic look in something much smaller that's going to be really good for run and gun, for those events, for those weddings, for low light situations. You can't go wrong. Our only hope or our only wish was that it came out like 2 years ago when we started to do April Fool's jokes about it, because then it would have been much more impressive for a longer amount of time. It will be available in September, but the big question is, do you wish that they put 8K in here and limited it to, say, 10 minutes without overheating or 15 minutes? Would that have made you happier? Do you like the features in it? Would you go with the Sony? Would you go with the Canon? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you guys very much for watching. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. And that's where I'm gonna leave it. Jared Polin, FroKnowsPhoto.com. See ya.